So, Robert, thank you very much. And welcome to this first panel on defence and security in transatlantic terms. As Robert said, I'm standing in for Deborah Haynes, who's in Abu Dhabi at the moment, I think looking at the operations of the F-35 in Opshada, I imagine, so she regrets that she can't be here. But we've got an hour to think about some of the defence and security aspects of British-American relationships. And I was told I had 2 minutes to set up the argument. And it's not a difficult argument to set up. We worry all the time about relationships between Britain and the United States, and our press is obsessed with this phrase, the special relationship, and we're constantly taking the temperature of it. And we do that by and large by looking at the political atmosphere between London and Washington, the chemistry between prime ministers and presidents and so on. And that's not irrelevant, of course. But at bedrock, the bedrock of the security and defence relationship, of course, is very specific. There's a very particular relationship on nuclear issues. There is a really important relationship in defence industry terms with the consolidation of defence industries. The transatlantic dimension of defence industries is extremely important. There is a critical relationship in intelligence, and that's, as it were, grown in importance over the last few years. The Five Eyes intelligence community, about which most of the public had never even heard until a couple of years ago, that Five Eyes community between Britain, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it's extremely anachronistic, but it is the best intelligence club in the world. Everybody wants to join it, and by definition, nobody else can. It's really important. And then, of course, there's the natural relationship between the armed services of the United States and Great Britain. And I always say that in military terms, we try to be what I call the 10% ally. We spend about 10% of what the United States spends on defense, and we get about 10% for it. Actually, it's now down to about 7%. But in order of magnitude terms, we are a sort of a 10% ally, and we calculate that that 10% gives us a certain amount of strategic influence. It gives us a stake in the game at a strategic level, so that we're not just a useful partner, we can be a strategically important partner. And that's an unspoken assumption, I think, that we've made for many, many years about our military relationship with the United States. So the question arises, of course, is that still true? If it's not true, do we need to work harder to preserve it? Or if we believe that it is slipping away inexorably, do we need to try to replace it in some way? These are important questions. So, it's not difficult to work out why defence and security should be a vibrant topic in any discussion about Britain and the United States. So I'm very pleased that we've got three completely different and extremely useful speakers about this topic. So we'll do them, I'll introduce people one by one. We're first going to hear from Dr. Karen Von Hippel. I'm delighted to say that Karen Von Hippel is an old colleague of mine from King's College from some years ago. She's now the Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. And in between that, between working together with us at King's College, she worked in CSIS in Washington in the think tank. She went into the State Department, worked in the State Department on counterterrorism, then on conflict and stabilization issues, and finally as an assistant secretary, yeah? And then finally as the Chief of Staff to General Allen, working on the anti-ISIL coalition, where she was right at the sharp end of State Department planning for what was going on in the Middle East. So Karen is ideally placed to give us a view from London and Washington, both governmental and non-governmental. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Mike was my former boss as well, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Lord Sashi, for inviting me into CPS as well, for including us, RUSI, today on this panel. I guess I wanted to just make a few opening framing remarks about what I'm concerned about globally, and I don't think it'll be anything that profound, but just to set the framework for the way that I see some of the challenges. And I guess the starting point that I would make is that I think that today's international security challenges are far more troubling than in the recent past. And whether it's North Korea or the conflicts in the Middle East or global terrorism or AI, cyber, hypersonic weapons, or even what the new role China is playing globally, assertive Russia, all these challenges are more troubling, and it's not necessarily because these challenges are that different in scope and scale than in the past, but rather because the United States isn't providing the leadership role that it has in the past in promoting alliances and pushing for the values that have undermined the international system since the end of the Second World War. So that's my concern. It's not that the challenges are that different in magnitude, but we're not getting the leadership and the partnerships that we've had before, led by the US. Now, even if in theory you could point to several significant US documents, the National Defense Strategy of 2018 has promoting partnerships and alliances as one of its 3 pillars, and the US National Security Strategy that came out in 2017, it was President Trump's first national security strategy, and that has as one of its 4 pillars promoting values and common interests. It could be, you could make the case that this is a little bit like the Nobel Prize sometimes, where President Trump's staff are putting things in that they care about. But in practice, if you listen to the rhetoric and you watch the behavior of President Trump since he's taken office, he has done the exact opposite. He has a disdain for partnerships and alliances, whether it's the European Union, whether it's NATO, the UN. He treats traditional allies in a disrespectful way. We've seen that in a number of cases, you know, including even with Angela Merkel of Germany. And so he's withdrawing the US traditional leadership role. And at the moment, there isn't another obvious country or grouping of countries filling that void. So you hear a lot about global Britain. You hear from the Foreign Secretary here about the rules-based international order. We're hearing about that a lot since President Trump got elected. And at the moment, there isn't a country or grouping of countries that is filling that void. And so we seem to be reverting to a more of a slightly Hobbesian approach to the world with sort of a new great power rivalries with China and fewer rules of the road to work on. And I guess my conclusion for this introductory piece is that none of the challenges we're dealing with today can be managed by one country alone, and they all have to be done in partnerships, and we've learned that over the last few decades. So that's sort of my opening remark, my concerns about the state of the world today.
Karen, thank you very much. Let's now move on to Sir Michael Fallon, the Right Honourable Sir Michael Fallon. He'd been known to everybody in this room. He's been an MP for Darlington and latterly for Sevenoaks in Kent. He's held government positions in education and science, in business and enterprise, in energy. In the last couple of years, he spent a lot of time in investment promotion, promoting startups and different sorts of enterprise. But of course, we've invited him here in particular because of his term as Minister of Defence from 2014 to 2017. And I have to say that at RUSI, opposite the MOD, we get a fair amount of buzz from the MOD just over the road. And during the period when Sir Michael Fallon was Minister of Defence, the reputation was always that he was a very well-respected, well-regarded and effective Minister of Defence, and we're always very grateful for that. So, Sir Michael.
Well, thank you, Michael, and I don't remember some of those RUSI reports saying exactly that at the time, but it's nice to hear it now. Let me, too, echo your tribute to the strength and endurance of the partnership between the United States and the United Kingdom. You can't get closer to an ally than sharing a common missile compartment on your Trident submarines. And that in itself, you know, is an extraordinary thing for two sovereign countries to share together. The exam questions set for us were what does the pivot to Asia cause us to change our outlook in the United Kingdom? What are the implications of the Trump administration for the future of NATO? And what is the current response in terms of our military preparedness here in the United Kingdom? And I'd like, if I may, just to say a little bit about each. First, on the pivot for Asia, it's worth recalling that for the Americans, World War II began in Asia. It ended in Asia. The United States was engaged in huge conflicts on the Korean Peninsula, in Vietnam, and so on. So I don't think there's anything particularly new about this kind of pivot towards Asia. Obama himself was billed as the Pacific president, and it may be that if it hadn't been for conflict in the Middle East and the war on terror, we might have seen the American administration moving closer to Asia earlier. Who knows? But that does still matter for us. Of course it matters for us. The relationship between America and China is fundamental for our own security and indeed for our own trade. Whether it's the South China Sea or the airspace or anywhere else, it affects our markets, our trading routes, and the alliances that we have in Asia Pacific are a key part, in my view, of our overall strategic approach. That's why back in the 2015 Strategic Defence Review, we elevated our partnership with both Australia and Japan. We said we would work harder at the Five Powers Defence Arrangement, and I recall signing the initial agreements at the Port of Duqm, giving us access to the Indian Ocean. So this is part of a process of us re-engaging again east of Suez. Now all of that, of course, must come with caveats. If you're going to play a bigger role in Indo-Pacific, then you need a bigger budget, and I will come back to that. If you're going to play a successful role in Asia-Pacific, then you need to do it in alliance with other countries. You can't simply conduct freedom of navigation operations or anything else with your own ships and planes. This has to be done as part of a concerted alliance approach. And thirdly, if you're going to do this successfully, you have to do it coherently. You have to make sure that all parts of your government are wired up together so that our security and our trading interests are properly aligned. The second question was where we are with NATO. With respect, and to try and get some tension into this, I don't wholly agree with Karin's analysis. If you look at what Trump actually finally said and did about NATO, it wasn't quite the same as where he started. Nonetheless, the 70th birthday is an opportunity to remind ourselves that NATO is the most successful defensive alliance in history, but does continue to need to be modernized. We all pledged at the Wales summit to increase our defense spending from a minimum of 2% by 2024. We're halfway there now. We're 5 years into that program, and a shocking number of members are nowhere near that 2% total, including some of the wealthier countries of Western Europe. So there is work to be done there. There is still work to be done to modernize the bureaucracy and the decision-making of NATO, to increase its internal mobility for both troops and Air Force, and crucially to avoid any further duplication with the European Union, which is always ready to dream up new headquarters and new badges for its own particular adventures. Thirdly, you asked us about the state of our own military and the threats that we face. I am quite clear that we are not at the moment spending what we should. Let me take you back 20 years to the last year of the last century, when we had Russia at the G8. There was no hint then of Russian resurgence. Before 9/11, before international terrorism and Daesh and whatever, we were spending 2.7%. We're now spending 2.1%. If we aim, as we should, as a proud and historic member of NATO on America's shoulder, if we aim to play a proper role around the world, dealing with the increase in submarine activity in the Atlantic, basing ourselves again in Indo-Pacific, contributing to the war against terror, whatever new international form that takes, helping fragile democracies in Asia and particularly in Africa. If we're going to do that, then, and be a global presence, then that requires a bigger budget to successfully deliver. And part of that, and I will conclude here, I believe lies in increasing industrial cooperation between our two countries. A huge amount of the 10-year equipment program that we negotiated in the 2015 SDSR, of course, is purchased from the United States. And that's why I think there's a real opportunity now to develop more industrial cooperation. Some of the larger companies, and we've got one here today, have committed to spending more inside the United Kingdom on their supply chains. And I believe we could take that further, not just for the very large companies, but for the medium-sized companies as well, and have those supply chain action plans, if you like, in return for these contracts, playing to the primacy of place in our industrial strategy and helping us do more to revive some of our regional economies. I think there's a huge opportunity there as we continue to modernize our military. Thank you.
So Michael, thank you very much. I'm very glad you raised the issue about supply chains at the end, because in setting up this panel, we knew we wanted to talk about geopolitical perspectives between London and Washington in terms of defense and security, but we also wanted to deal with some of the underlying fabric, which is exactly that defense relationship, the economic and industrial relationship, and supply chain issues. So I'm delighted that we've got Richard Daniel, who's the Chief Executive and a Managing Director of Raytheon UK. Raytheon's a $27 billion company, 67,000 employees around the world, and Richard is in charge of the UK end of all of that. And there's a good pamphlet around today. I think it's available outside, a CPS pamphlet, Tipping the Balance, Point Maker. Tipping the balance on how trade and investment can rebalance the UK economy. And it uses, as one of the case studies, what Raytheon is doing at Broughton in North Wales as an example of a US company helping the regional economies of the United Kingdom. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Anyway, Richard.
Thank you, and again, thanks for inviting me onto this panel. The two previous speakers have really set up the challenge quite nicely. The breadth of the threat that we're trying to address from the armed forces are dealing with, and the strength of the partnership being an important part of how we address that from an industrial perspective. So, if I may, I'd like to look at it from the industrial angle at this point to see how we're trying to solve that problem and that additional pressure that occurs on the defence budgets that are available. So, just a little bit about Raytheon. Raytheon is a technology company, and everything we do is underpinned by technology. And we've got quite a heritage here in the UK. Goes back over 100 years, but in fact, we were involved in the first air defence system, which was deployed during the Second World War, a thing called Chain Home, and I think that anchors us firmly in the defence and security arena. What I'm trying to do, and what Raytheon are trying to do here in the UK, is to provide an alternative approach to a typical offshore parented organisation, and how we're trying to address the challenges that have been set out so well, which is to provide a breadth of capability, but at the same time addressing both sovereign control and providing sovereign capability, and creating prosperity. Prosperity creation being one of the three objectives of the national security strategy. So we've produced a business model which allows us to do that, and it's probably easier if I use a couple of examples, and we've already touched on the one at Broughton in North Wales, but let me think about cyber. Cyber is a broad challenge for us all, both in industry as well as from a national security perspective, and something that we need to create deep capability here in the UK often needs to be, by its nature, very sovereign capability. And Raytheon, around 6 years ago, decided that we needed to create that strong cyber capability, and we leveraged what we had in the US. So we'd for many years been developing capabilities in the US to protect ourselves as an organization, but also to then offer as solutions to the various customers. So we took that seed corn and committed investment from the US, and we started to build a capability here, first in Gloucester, and has been fairly commonplace for people to build cyber capability. But as we continue to grow, we then realized that we needed to access more talent, and I think talent is a critical element of being able to provide this capability. So we opened a second cyber hub in Salford in Greater Manchester. And I think that goes to some of the points in the pamphlet that regional investment, I think, is critical to enable us to tap into the breadth of capability that exists across the UK. And to your point, Sir Michael, about the supply chain, one of the other things we did at that time, recognizing that we needed to be able to tap into a broad set of capabilities that already existed, was create an ecosystem of both small and medium-sized enterprises right through to large companies. And in this way, we were able to provide a really agile approach to putting together solutions which were needed to address the threats that had been identified. And if I take that now looking forward, so where's next? And training is another underpinning capability that needs to be addressed. And here we're taking the scale that we have in providing training for the US Army, the transformational technology that we've adopted in the commercial space to look at the automotive industry, bringing all that together with our knowledge of what the UK Ministry of Defence are looking for, and providing that transformational capability. And I think by using this transatlantic cooperation, which I do every day, that's how I drive the business, I think that then gives you the best of both worlds almost. We start to provide value for money solutions to address the challenging defence budget arena. We give access to technologies which can then address this complex threat environment that we're dealing with. But at the same time, we are committed as an organisation to invest in Britain to create the sovereign control that's needed and the prosperity that comes with it.
Richard, thank you very much. I want to come back to this SME question in a moment, but first of all, on your behalf, we've got 35 minutes now, let me identify some of the questions that may have come out of this. There's an issue about NATO. Karin was rather pessimistic about it. Sir Michael was more sanguine about the future of NATO. And I guess we're faced with this issue where President Trump comes to a NATO summit, and in effect, at a political level, he wrecks the summit. And yet the Pentagon, certainly under Jim Mattis, was doing everything that NATO, European NATO would have wanted in terms of reinforcement and preparation and so on. So how do we square that circle? Karen, how do you square
I'm
that?
not necessarily pessimistic about NATO. I'm more pessimistic about this leadership challenge globally. And without the U.S. working very closely with allies and caring about the role of allies, providing the leadership globally. Now, NATO is an example, but I don't think NATO, I think NATO will continue to thrive. Actually, there was a concern, obviously, about NATO after the Cold War finished, and it's a Cold War relic, and turns out it really proved its importance in the Balkans, of course, but also in Afghanistan, which was an out-of-area conflict, and really provided the necessary platform and coordination for all the troops that were there. It's a different issue of what we were doing in Afghanistan, what we're still doing in Afghanistan. That's a different conversation. But I do think NATO will be important, and I think the challenge with President Trump is, of course, that at these NATO summits, so many other world leaders spend so much time trying to get him to commit to Article 5 and the alliance structure that they aren't focusing on all the necessary reforms that Sir Michael mentioned. Absolutely, NATO needs to reform, and that is a positive thing you can say about President Trump's contribution. His disruptive ability is all of these institutions have become fairly staid. The UN, the EU, NATO, et cetera, they all need to be reformed. Sometimes it takes a disruptive presence to really provide that injection to make such reform. So I'm not pessimistic about NATO, but I'm concerned about NATO, and I'm concerned, obviously, about where we're going globally.
But last year, President Trump publicly mused on 3 or 4 occasions that the United States might withdraw from NATO.
Yeah.
Now, and Congress immediately reacted and said, well,
Right.
we would never allow that
Well,
to
that's-
happen.
yeah.
But that must be undermining to NATO's collective sense of itself, mustn't it?
Although recently he's been very supportive of the Secretary General
Yeah, yes.
of NATO, who obviously has managed him quite well. Look, at the end of the day, he gets distracted, as we've seen, by so many different issues on a daily basis. And I think many of the people who work with him, and in particular in Congress, are super, they're very cognizant of the importance of NATO to U.S. security as well as global security. Even today, I don't know if anyone noticed the latest tweet, which was about China and Japan paying more for security of the shipping lanes in the Straits of Hormuz. And he was saying they should be paying more for the security in those shipping lanes. And then immediately after, Senator Lindsey Graham, who is a big supporter now of President Trump, tweeted that security in the sea lanes is vital to all of our security, including the U.S. So there is pushback when he does that.
Yeah. So, Michael.
Well, I'm not as pessimistic about that. As I said, I think it's very important to distinguish between what Trump says and what he actually does. I think it was McGovern who said you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. I don't think we'd accuse Donald Trump of poetry, but there was, of course, nervousness. I was there at his first summit in Brussels, just after his election. But again, if you look at what he's actually been doing, he's been saying the same things about Europe paying a higher share of the budget as all his predecessors have said. It was Obama who signed the Wales Pledge, but it goes all the way back, to presidents. Even Carter said exactly the same thing. So there's nothing new in telling Germany or France, quite wealthy countries, that really they ought to be paying a bigger share. Secondly, he recommitted to Article 5. There was some initial concern about that. If you go to his Warsaw speech, he absolutely recommitted to the principle of Article 5. Thirdly, he sent his troops across to Europe as part of enhanced forward presence, stationed in Poland. There was no suggestion that allocation should be downgraded in any way. And fourthly, having said that the Afghan war was not winnable, or whatever he did say, he did in the end listen to Jim Mattis and the local commanders, and they asked that America is staying the course in Afghanistan. So again, I think you do have to look carefully at what is actually done on the ground and where he does in the end listen to advice.
What about the broader question of his attitude towards, Karen mentioned it, the rules-based international order? Because some of his policy toward the Middle East, for instance, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, recognizing the Golan Heights, which after all is still under occupation, but the Russians take great note of the fact that the president seems to be altering the rules in ways that they will find quite helpful when it comes to Ukraine and Crimea. Is this a worry that he doesn't seem quite to understand how much some of his statements seem to undermine the rules-based system?
I note that worry, and when I travel around the world, I hear that. Allies feel that they're rather neglected, that he doesn't attach the importance he should to these key partnerships. And it's certainly true that some of the major international institutions on which the rules-based order depends, are atrophying and do require refreshment, whether it's the WTO or whether it's the operation of the Security Council veto at the United Nations, or indeed the modernization that's required at NATO itself. And here I think there's a real role for the United Kingdom. We like to think we're kind of good at this stuff. We promoted a lot of these institutions after the war. We promote the rule of law and we defend democracy. I think post-Brexit, there's a real role for the United Kingdom, actually, in re-examining the rules-based international order piece by piece and see what do we need to do in each of these institutions to improve the governance, to call out misbehavior, and to properly implement sanctions that are agreed.
Karin, RUSI produced a rather incisive paper on the rules-based international order about a month ago. It was very good.
Malcolm, our deputy, wrote a very good paper saying that there are many rules. Well, let's just say there are many orders.
Many levels.
Layers of rules. But no, I agree with that point. And I think that actually this country is good at leading on a number of these issues, and it doesn't have to do it on its own, but someone needs to provide the leadership right now. And I think everyone just got used to waiting for the US to do certain things, or the European Union, and I just think getting on with it and convening meetings and providing strategies and promoting those strategies is absolutely the right thing to do.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this question of global politics, and particularly some of the issues we've raised about Britain playing a global role, global Britain going east of Suez or going back east of Suez, and what that may imply. I want to come back to that. But let me just go to some of the things that Richard was saying, because I'm particularly interested, Richard, you talked about the ecosystem, that Raytheon is very keen to promote the ecosystem. That too is, I have to say, something that Russi produced a very good book on a couple of years ago, the defense ecosystem. But SMEs in Britain, I mean, we have more SMEs in Britain than all of our European partners. We are an SME, not driven economy, but we are an economy that likes SMEs, and we've got a lot of good small companies. What have you found as what are the pros and cons of our SMEs? I mean, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the SME side of our ecosystem? Because you see it from a very practical point of view.
We absolutely do, and they're from making sure that we have a way of working with SMEs that is comfortable for them. Because one of the things that you don't want to do with an SME is stifle their own innovation, and I think there's a danger sometimes that they'll feel that their own intellectual property is being harvested by Prime, and as a consequence
that's what a lot of them complain about BAE Systems. They say that we work for BAE, but BAE Systems actually overshadows you too much.
Yeah, well, we recognise that, and we spent a lot of time working with SMEs to ensure that we approach that very aspect, because it's important to them. And what we came to was just a really practical sense of we just need to use this technology in the areas that we're focusing on. And we run a competition on an annual basis, a thing called Spark. And what we do is we put challenges out to SMEs, they come back, and then we fund them to develop that. And part of that is a standard set of terms and conditions which they can be comfortable with. Because what you want is the SMEs to have the freedom to continue to innovate, and what they need is a prime contractor who can bring that through and provide the assurance to the ultimate customer that there's a substance there behind it, because they're often too small to take on some of these contracts. So it needs to be a happy partnership rather than one under tension, and I think we spent a lot of time trying to do that. But fundamentally, if you think about the changing threat base that we're dealing with, I think what we can all be clear about is that there needs to be an agility in the way that we approach the insertion of technology into defence capability. And we need to look at that from all sorts of areas. Be nimble in the way that we approach that technology insertion. And some of that comes from SME, some of that comes from our internal research and development, some of it comes from the research and development that's been done in the US. And I think the trick is to bring it all together in a coherent way, which puts the best capability in the hands of the armed forces.
So just before we probe that question of agility, nimbleness a little bit more, can you just give us a sense of, what's your sense of, what's the strength of Britain's SME picture, and what are the weaknesses from your perspective? I mean, what do you worry about in our SME ecosystem?
So one of the things we've gone out of our way to do is to help the SMEs that are working with us to look at cyber essentials, make sure that they've got the resilience that they need in their own networks, because our success is only as strong as the supply chain that sits in it. So I think
cyber security in the supply chain is a major issue for you, presumably, in your supply chain.
Well, we need to be assured that people are protected. So we've gone out, done some training ourselves to try and help them do that. And I think with SMEs, sometimes they haven't got the resources that a big company has, and by helping them, I think that secures them and addresses what is a potential weakness and turns it into ultimately a strength.
So, Michael, you've worked with SMEs in many departments of government that you've been in control of.
Yes, and you know, I think we do have huge strengths here, particularly some of those companies that come out of the universities that are developing, you know, really at the cutting edge of some of these technologies. But they're fearful. They worry they're going to lose their intellectual property. I think they're over-dependent sometimes on the primes. And they do have difficulties, if we're honest about this, in accessing defense contracts on both sides of the Atlantic, fighting their way into the Pentagon and fighting their way into the Ministry of Defense. And we do need to make that easier. We set up something called the Defense Growth Partnership to bring both sides together here. The two things I'd like to see happen, if I may, is first, I think we do need a better balance. The United States defense sector was one of the, as I said, was the biggest single winner of the equipment program under the SDSR 2015. And it is important that our British companies get more of an entree over there, over in the United States. The Defence Trade Cooperation Treaty is not working as smoothly as it should be. And you know, that's something we need to give more attention to make sure that our SMEs, and particularly medium-sized companies, can get in to the contractual work over the Atlantic. On this side of the Atlantic, as I said, I would like to see this concept of supply chain action plans developed. I started this with offshore wind when I was the Minister for Renewables. In granting a contract for difference to a new wind farm, we required them, and we had to be very careful because of European Union procurement law, which of course doesn't apply in defence, so it actually would be easier to do this in defence. We required them to submit supply chain action plans. And of course, they immediately came to the Department of Energy and said, well, what is a supply chain action plan? What should be in it? And you know, we advised them, couldn't tell them, but we advised them that they needed to properly look at how they were developing local skills, how they were working with local SMEs, wherever it was, on Teesside or on the Humber or whatever, and how, whether they properly understood the value of each stage of the supply chain. Now, we have these relationships, I think, with the big majors like Raytheon and Boeing, but I would like to see, for more of the contracting that we do, more specific supply chain action plans put in place so that we can help revive some of these, particularly Northern and Midlands economies.
Mm-hmm. That wouldn't be any problem to Raytheon, would it?
No, I mean, we invest in the Northwest for both our airborne ISR, and with inside Raytheon now, because of the capability we've created in North Wales, we are the centre of excellence for special mission aircraft and providing Sentinel and Shadow aircraft to the Royal Air Force, and it's a fabulous success story. And now we're looking to see, well, how do we take that to the export market? And I think, and when you look around, there's a hub of SMEs supporting us in that region. So I think that works well. The other point, I think, is that we've recognised, and you talk about access to the US market, which is a concern that's raised. We've created what we term a global factory, a global supply chain. So in our facility in Scotland, we are part of the overall global supply chain for Raytheon. So rather than just looking at the smaller volumes that are associated with the UK buy, what we do is take the global requirement, and then we build parts on that basis, the bulk of which are exported straight back into the US and form part of the US defence supply chain. And I think sometimes it's difficult to measure what's going on below the prime level, and I think it's an element that we got to do some work on to see where there are other pockets of activity. And of course, wherever we're building things, there are a supply chain sat underneath them.
Yes. We mentioned agility and the need to be nimble, and I want to put that in a broader context just before we move back to some of the geopolitical questions. Because if we think about some of the new disruptive technologies, and we're not sure where these technologies are going to go yet, quantum computing, as and when it arrives in the next 10 or 20 years, which will revolutionize computing, nanotechnologies, gene editing, AI that we worry about all the time. Think about all these disruptive technologies. It's not clear how any of these technologies might be weaponized. But what is clear is that if they can be weaponized, it won't be us doing it. It'll be the United States and China and Russia, part of it. And so one of the questions that I always have is, what can we do, even if we're up with the science, even if our universities understand the science of gene editing and nanotechnologies and quantum computing, when we're not going to, the Europeans in general will not be weaponizing these things. So how do we remain agile, and do we back winners? I mean, I know the MOD thinks about this quite a lot, and I know it did in your time, Sir Michael, but do you have a sense of what we ought to be doing to remain agile in the face of these really disruptive technologies?
Well, I mean, first of all, we've got to keep catalyzing the work that is being done on the research side in our universities and so on, and getting it across into procurement. But second, we've got to keep close to some of our European allies in terms of some of the major research programs that are now underway on missiles, on future combat aircraft, and so on. There's no point us simply, opting out of all that if we don't have to. I think it's quite important we do keep abreast of some of those technologies. And then, as I said, I think we've really got to intensify the relationship that we have with the United States.
No, I agree, and I think there are technologies where we need to establish joint programs between the US and the UK with advantage, particularly where the US are leading. And Karen raised the point of hypersonics.
Yeah,
the hypersonics is a absolutely clear example that the funding required to develop hypersonic capability.
So just for everyone's understand, we're dealing with hypersonic missiles here.
That's right.
Very fast missiles, which are so fast that the present defense system simply can't catch them, can't keep up with them.
That's right. And as you might imagine, the investments required are enormous. And I think that what we ought to be doing, and the US have definitely got the lead in hypersonics within the NATO context. Looking at how we join up and how we each leverage that means that we can get those leading edge technologies, at a cost that is affordable inside the defense budget.
Can I just to follow up on that? I think this is a really critical area to be promoting alliances and also international agreements, because there are no agreements about how these weapons can be used. Russia, China, and the United States are in the lead in really pushing for these weapon systems, and they could have an enormous impact. They could really change the way we look at deterrence, mutually assured destruction, all those big questions, and there isn't even an effort right now to come up with some sort of international agreement on these weapons. So here's an example of something where I do think the UK could be pushing very hard to get that going.
Yes, as we think traditionally about all of the exotic technologies that could undermine us, here in a sense is a brand new, very old technology of just a dumb missile which is so quick you can't do anything about it. If it targets you, it will hit you because it just goes too fast for you to stop it. There's something very traditional about that, and yet it undermines an awful lot of thinking.
Right, it could destroy aircraft carriers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that could...
And aircraft carriers in particular. Okay. Speaking of aircraft carriers, we mentioned global Britain, and Sir Michael mentioned the move to have a presence, at least, greater presence east of Suez. The Navy now seems to have a policy of keeping one warship always available or on station or on tour in Asia, and that's clearly an established policy. We do much more now east of Suez in the Middle East. We've strengthened all of our bases on the Gulf, and our armed forces prepare to operate east of Suez as well as everything else they prepare for. Let's just think about this question of the feasibility of global Britain in the context of our relationship with the United States. Karen, I mean, I know, again, Rusi does quite a lot of thinking about this one way or another.
Well, I mean, we don't really know what global Britain is. Yeah. And I think when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he never defined it. So maybe when if and when he becomes Prime Minister, he'll define it for all of us. But you know, what's been interesting to me is over the last 3 years watching the concern in this country grow about China. So 3 years ago, if you would have said, you know, how do we feel about China? You wouldn't have had that many people, in the non-expert audience that concerned. Of course, if you spend time in Japan or Korea or Taiwan, they're overly consumed. And the concern here has been mostly about Russia. In the last 2 years, that's changed significantly. And I think there's an enormous recognition of the importance of China, the weight of China, whether it's about the Huawei decision or about new weapon systems, challenging the United States, a trade war with the United States and the spillover of that. And here's an area where it's not entirely clear to me what the strategy is by any country, really, at how to address this threat.
But I've heard you say, Karen, in other interviews on the media, that President Trump's overarching foreign policy goal is some sort of grand deal with China to recreate or rebalance the America-China relationship, which makes absolute sense. I mean, do you think there's a fair chance that might happen?
I mean, it's an important goal to have because I think previous U.S. administrations have been treading too lightly on China for a number of reasons, and Trump has just kind of gone smashing through the middle. He's taking a very different approach. And in fact, we shouldn't be afraid of China, and in many respects, even the U.S. government was afraid of disrupting the apple cart too much. And I think you see China on its back foot. China doesn't always know how to deal with this. Now, he wants to make a deal. Who knows what he is envisaging? And the concern I have is more, is he going to throw Taiwan under the bus? How would what is a deal to him? What is that perfect deal for him?
But if some sort of deal, say in election year or in a second term, if some sort of deal began to shape up, then that would be a pretty important geopolitical reality that Britain would have to readjust to.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be pretty good for us, in the sense that it actually might make for a path through which we could start to negotiate differently with China.
I mean, certainly anything is better than the trade war, and that's what we're dealing with now, and that puts a lot of pressure on everything from U.S. farmers all the way to, across the supply chain that you're talking about.
Okay. So, Michael, come on. Where will Britain?
There's an awful lot on that.
You must know. You must have thought about it more than some of us.
Well, I'm clear. We're going ahead with Brexit. We do that in the autumn successfully. I am clear that we do need, as I said, to look again at the opportunities. I voted Remain, as it happens. I don't regret that vote. But I will certainly regret not looking for the new opportunities that Brexit does open up to us. And in my view, that is staying close, of course, to our European allies, but first of all, continuing to defend fragile democracies around the world. Secondly, playing our part in strengthening the rules-based international order across a range of these different agreements and treaties and international organizations, and working even more closely with our allies in NATO, with the United States, and with the other Five Eyes partners. So I think there is a global role there for Britain, which I hope both the candidates will give us more definition on, as the next few weeks unfold. So far as China is concerned, yes, of course, we would be the casualties in any conflict between a China first and an American first tension. But I think we have to persuade America that these international institutions do serve a purpose. Of course, they need to be improved. Organizations like the WTO have not been as effective as they should be. But we have to persuade America that they do have a purpose, and we have to persuade China too, that one day, despite what it's doing in the South China Sea, that one day China may well depend, as it expands its influence, its blue water navy, it may well depend on adherence to these various conventions, and that it would be in China's own interest to abide by them. You mentioned carriers. Can I just say a quick word about carriers? Because I was slightly staggered arriving in the Ministry of Defence that carriers were such a fraught topic. There were people who were in favour of them and people who were against them.
It's easy to start an argument in the MOD, just say carriers.
Very easy to start an argument in the MOD. We're one of only 4 countries in the world building aircraft carriers, by the way. And I know there is a section of the defence establishment that thinks that carriers are redundant. I note that carriers actually, were part of the international coalition against Daesh terrorism. Carriers fight terrorists, which is perhaps not what they were originally planned for, but is what in the Gulf they certainly ended up doing over three and a half very long years from the American carriers and indeed from the French carrier. Building 2 carriers, of course, gives us one always available and allows us, should we wish to plan these deployments in Asia Pacific. But carriers do not operate on their own. And we will only be able to operate them successfully if we operate them in concert with other navies. And certainly when I was involved in this, other navies were queuing up to be part of the task force, for the first deployments of Queen Elizabeth.
They are impressive ships. When the Prince of Wales, the second carrier, when it's commissioned next year, the person who commands it on its final scheduled voyage, if it's still afloat then, before it goes to the breakers yard, that person hasn't been born yet. Sometime in the next couple of years, a little boy or girl, presumably in Britain, maybe not, but probably in Britain, will be born, who will grow up to have a successful career in the Navy and will be the commander of the Prince of Wales on its last voyage. So can you imagine what else is likely to change in the defence field during that lifetime, not yet begun? But that's the nature of big defence procurement. It has to last a long time. Richard, you must have some thoughts on this.
Absolutely, and just picking up on that point about the big defence procurements and lasting a long time, what will become more and more critical is how you refresh the technology on board those capabilities.
Yeah, the carrier is a biscuit tin. It's what you put on it that matters.
It's the. I wouldn't want to say this to the First Sea Lord, but it's kind of the truck carrying all the sensors and the capability, isn't it, to project the and it's a fabulous vessel. I've had the opportunity to be on it, but I think from a global Britain perspective, from my perspective, it's about Britain as a trading nation. It's about the high regard that Britain's armed forces and the capability that they have is seen throughout the world. And why is Raytheon investing so heavily here in the UK and to the UK landed company? It's because it recognises that, and we do about half our business is export, half is domestic. And having that recognition that if it's used by the British Armed Forces, that really means something when you take that abroad. And so Michael talked about the Defence Growth Partnership, and one element of that is is strengthening the DSO and looking at how we can improve the way that leverage is used to stimulate trade overseas.
We're going through a political nervous breakdown at the moment, and we all know that, and there's no way around it, but that's where we are. From your point of view, Richard, is that seriously depressing your plans for the future, or does Raytheon and your control of Raytheon UK just keep looking towards the mid to late 20s? Are you taking that mid to long-term view?
Absolutely. I think it would be madness not to. So we're continuing to invest. You may have seen the press. We've just acquired a new manufacturing site because we can see that the future over the next 5 years, we need to increase the manufacturing capacity inside the organisation. We're continuing to grow our cyber business and our airborne ISR. You have to, we have a strategy. We believe in our strategy. We need some stability, and so we watch very closely, and we put the protections in place that we need to put in place, depending on what type of a Brexit we may get to, and what the economic conditions might look like. So we do what every good industrialist
But hedging your bets as a company is not seriously diminishing your view of future investment.
No, absolutely not. You said it before, we're invested in Britain. It is part of our strategy. We can see the benefit of being here, the growth that is available to us, certainly over the next 5 years, and we are continuing to stay the course. I think it's important that we do so.
So, Michael, you're on record as calling for greater defence expenditure, and you're known as a good strategic thinker. You must be focused on the mid-20s when you're thinking about defence and security.
Yes, I am, and I'm not quite as pessimistic. We are getting very pessimistic as a country at the moment, and you referred to it. In 4 weeks' time, we'll have a new Prime Minister and a new government. In the autumn, we will be completing, we hope, the Brexit process, and we will have a spending review. That for the first time, after 9 years of only a very gentle increase in the defence budget and cuts elsewhere, will enable us to reset our priorities. So we have a real opportunity now under a new government to reset our spending priorities, and I'm very clear in my view, given the way the threats have multiplied and given the role that we want to take on in the world, that has to be a much bigger budget than it is at the moment.
Karin, how should the United Kingdom present itself to the United States for the thinking about the mid-20s? I mean, you know, the US is looking at us all the time. They're not obsessed, but they're very interested in what's going on in Britain. What's the message to send to Washington?
I mean, that it's a confident, assertive country with a lot of ideas, and it's going to charge ahead. I mean, you know, you're not seeing those strategies being explained in the way that we're used to from the United States. And so others just need to get on with it. So what are we going to do about Syria's civil war? It's not clear. Russia and Iran are now in the lead. What are the next steps in North Korea? What are we going to do about all these ISIL detainees and their families? What are we going to do about hypersonic weapons? There are plenty of challenges that we are not getting the global leadership on. And, you know, I think this country...
But we've become too introspective ourselves, haven't we?
Yeah, because of Brexit, and for the last 3 years, it's been so internally focused. And many other European countries are in the same way. So I don't, you know, I'm not entirely sure how to shake that off, but...
Not for nothing, Sir Michael, were you informally called the Minister for the Today programme when you were in government, because you were the one that they turned out to give a long-term view and to be positive and straight about in answering the questions that were put to you. You always were.
Well, that's very kind of you. But, you know, we can't keep digging ourselves into this kind of, you know, depression that we're trapped in between, you know, essentially Remainer Parliament trying to legislate a Leave agenda. We're coming to the end now, one way or another, of this process in the autumn. We will have a new government, and as I said, you know, that government will have the opportunity now to reset its spending priorities and take this country forward.
Okay, one final comment from each of the panelists. Richard, what message would you like to leave with the audience here?
So I think, you know, despite what's going on and the political challenges that exist at the moment and the backdrop of Brexit, I think that, you know, there is a place to continue to drive growth inside the organisation. And from Raytheon's perspective, I think we found a model which addresses the challenges that we see in front of us.
Sir Michael.
Well, just to our American friends, you know, don't give up on us. You know, we've been through a tricky period in the last couple of years. Of course we have, because we've had a government with no majority, you know, finding it very difficult to legislate even the things that it really wants to legislate. But we're going to have a new government in 4 weeks' time. And as I said, we've got the opportunity now to design, you know, a stronger future for this country.
I see Sir Kevin Tebbit down there nodding vigorously when you say to the Americans, don't give up on us. Absolutely. Karin.
Well, a counter message should be for Europeans and for Brits not to give up on the United States as well. So yes, I think it goes both ways.
This is a time to hold on to all the threads of the past, right, to recognize what we've held in the past and to think about taking them forward into the future, but to be a bit more confident in ourselves and in our friends in the United States. That leaderships come and go, but countries and political cultures are there. And in the next session, Anne Applebaum is going to lead a discussion on the Anglo-Saxon model in need of repair, ? So I think that brings us exactly to the point where we need to consider the Anglo-Saxon model. But for now, we have a 20-minute coffee break. But on your behalf, let me thank Richard Daniels, Sir Michael Fallon, and Karen Von Hippel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure.